Good morning. I know some of you might have been expecting to see Bruce here, but sorry to disappoint you. Bruce is in San Diego. If you want to listen to him, you probably can, but it's going to take you a couple hours because he's with Vivian's son's congregation. Her son-in-law, excuse me. Get it right, yeah. Is an elder out there, and that's how Bruce said that's how he got the gig, is what I think how he phrased it to me. And he's out there with them this week, and we're glad that is happening. Thank you for your presence. Glad to see each one of you here. I know it's kind of a mixed up day outside in a way. I was outside last night, like to froze. got real, I mean, it was amazing how much the temperature dropped, and this is supposed to be spring. And we're looking at possible freezes tonight, possibly. I don't know. Throughout the Bible history, or Old Testament times, basically what I'm talking about, people have served God faithfully. And some of them got special, I won't say recognition, but in some respect it was that. And I know God is not a respecter of persons, but He is a respecter of character. And there's some phrases that are used for some of the people. In Genesis, the 5th chapter, 24th verse, you don't have to read because we're going to hit some of these real quickly, but you're welcome to. The scripture says that Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him. Enoch walked with God. In the next chapter, Genesis 6, verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. I did a search for that phrase. Do you realize that's the only two people that got that designation of walked with God are Enoch and Noah? I thought that was kind of odd in a way. Were they the only ones that walked with God? Of course not. But then we get a little bit further, we get past the flood in the time of Abraham. And in James, the 2nd chapter, verse 23, James refers back to Abraham. And he says, the scripture was fulfilled which said, Abraham believed God, and it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. A friend of God. I couldn't find anybody else that was actually called a friend of God, but Moses came close. In Exodus, the 33rd chapter, verse 11, and the Lord spake unto Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. Two people designated basically as a friend of God. But there's one that sticks out. The only person that has this designation that I could find was David. How was David referred to in Scripture? A man after God's own heart. And nobody else is referred to in that respect. Now, I'm singling them out. They're special men, only because they served God faithfully. There were other men that served God faithfully. They're just not referred to in that respect. I mean, there were tons of them. And Hebrews 11, there's that, the hall of faith right there. And the ones that are talked about there. And then throughout there's people. Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. I mean, we could go on and on. Some of the judges, some of the kings. But David held a special place in God's heart because he was a man after God's heart. And I want to look at that today for a few minutes from the perspective of what was that? First of all, what does it mean to be a man after God's own heart? And then I want to look at some of the scriptures as to can we see some of the qualities that David had and how he lived as a man after God's own heart, and in some of the writings that he did. David was a prolific writer. He wrote most of the Psalms. And even though some of the Psalms I'll refer to may not have been written by David, they express the same attitude. Because this is a character issue. Those men, if you looked at those 5 men, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David, they're the same basic. They are faithful men of God. So I thought, okay, what does it mean to be a man after God's own heart? And as a person who is fairly computer illiterate, I say fairly, sometimes I wonder, I thought, well, whenever I have a question, what do? I Google it, because I wanted to find out what was said there. What does that mean according to some people today? And I got something that I thought was pretty good, I'll be honest with you. It means your life is in harmony with the Lord. What is important to Him is important to you. And this went on a little bit to say if God says do this, you do this. If He says don't do this, you don't do that. So basically being obedient to God. So what we're going to focus on is how was David a man after God's own heart? What does it mean? We know what it means. But first of all, what does it mean by heart? A man after God's own heart. Now, God is a spirit. God is spirit. Does God have a heart? Depends on how I'm using that word. He doesn't have a body, so He doesn't have a heart like I have that pumps blood. But what is the heart that is referred to that David has that's after God's own heart?
Character.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the best words I could come up with too, is character. It's his mind, it's his intellect, it's what he really is. And that's what David was. David was a man that reflected basically, I would guess in one respect, what God is, as much as could be. But what is one thing we know that David had that goes against the heart of God? He's not perfect. And none of the 5 men, there's very little said about Enoch, and there's more said about Noah, Abraham, and Moses. But they weren't perfect. And as I thought about this, and this is a lesson that I've been rolling over in my mind for a while anyhow, can we have a heart that's after God's own heart? Because not only did David have it, I think Enoch had it, I think Noah had it, I think Abraham had it, I think Moses, Joshua, Gideon. You could go on and name lots of Daniel. We've been talking about Daniel in the Wednesday night class last quarter with Jody. Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. These were righteous servants of God. We're not perfect. God is, but we're not. We know that it says that all have sinned in Romans 3:23 and come short of the glory of God. Now, in that really what he's meaning there, all Jew and Gentile, but really every man has too. And in 1 John, the 1st chapter, verse 8, it says, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. So we all sin. But can we still have a heart after God's own heart? And I'm going to have 4 or 5 examples of what I think that show David's heart. But this isn't just about what I'm saying, okay? If you think of one that's a good one, bring it up. Let's talk about it. Because I think David wrote so much, David did so much. And for the time we've got, let's talk about that. And then I'm going to look at some of the sayings that he did. As a young man, what did David do as a young man? What was his job? Shepherd. He was a shepherd. What kind of shepherd was he? A good one, a bad one, mediocre? Come on, guys, wake up. What did David do when a bear came? He fought it. He killed him. What else came up and he had to contend with? A lion. David fought a lion and a bear. And what else did David fight as a young man? Not a kid, but a young man. I'm sorry? Okay, Goliath. That's exactly. He may have been a little man because in comparison. How tall was Goliath? About 9 feet 3 inches. It depends on how you want to come up with that. He was tall. Can you imagine Bruce is what, 6'7"? That's still 1.5 foot on top of Bruce. Remember the thing we had in VBS several years ago, Goliath? I won't call him a statue. But something to get a representative. Goliath was a huge man. And it talks about how heavy his armor was, how heavy his helmet was, and his beam. Did David shy away from that? No. Turn to 1 Samuel, the 17th chapter. David was not a part of the fighting forces of Israel. He was too young. And his father had sent him to take some provisions to their brothers who were fighting. And as a young man, as any young man, I'm sure he got enamored by what he saw with the soldiers, what they were doing. And he was there when Goliath came out to challenge the armies of God. And starting in verse 32. He's come out, he said, David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail of him. Because David had come up before this, nobody would go out to fight Goliath. Challenge was made day after day, and nobody went out to fight Goliath. Nobody. But look what David said. He said unto Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and he and fight with this Philistine. Your servant, I will go and fight with him. And Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. He's not only big, he's strong, and he's been fighting for years, David. My page just flipped on me. Give me a second here again. And David said to Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I caught him by his beard and smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them. And I like the last part of that verse. Seeing as he has defied the armies of the living God. What did David have at that point in time?
These animals are kind of like the kings of the animal kingdom. I mean, they're both greatly feared and very dangerous. So he'd already, through faith in God, exhibited extreme courage and been able to overcome. So he had that same faith with Goliath.
Yeah, and I never thought about the fact that they were like the top of their profession. I don't know profession. It's the food chain, yeah. Top of the food chain. They're the king. I mean, the lion is what? King of beasts. And like Alan said, he had faith in God. Here's a young man. And think about what, like we talked about when Jody was teaching in Daniel. Those young men, the faith they had in God. David had that. And I don't think that faith ever went away. He did it, and we know the story, how he went out with some stones, went out and look down a little bit further in that same verse. In verse 40, and he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in his shepherd's bag which he had, even in script, and his sling in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. And the Philistine came on and drew near to David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. I mean, he's even got somebody out there to guard him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, it says, and ruddy and of fair complexion. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest out to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and a spear and a shield. I come unto thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Not only did he have faith in God, he had respect. He feared God, more so than what he feared Goliath or a lion or a bear. And we know the result of the story, that David slew Goliath. David was a man of faith, of deep faith. But we also know that David had some serious issues. I want to go back. I should have started out, I guess, with Bathsheba, because although it happens later after he's king. Because we realize that none of us are faithful. I mean, we're faithful, but none of us are perfect. Well, let's go ahead and take them in order. Let's talk about some other ones. Okay. And we'll come to Bathsheba a little bit later. 1 Samuel 24. That's got to be 2 Samuel 24, really, I guess. Because he's fleeing from... I went over this and over this, but still. David's fleeing from Saul. Okay, this has to be up here in first. Yeah, 1 Samuel 24, I'm sorry. After David was anointed king by Samuel, what did Saul do? He sought to kill David, and he chased David. And David knew that this was happening, and he ran from Saul. And here in the 24th chapter of 1 Samuel, Saul was returning from the Philistines, and it says, It was told him that David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. And Saul took 3,000 chosen men of all Israel, this is the second verse of 1 Samuel 24, and went to seek David and his men among the rocks of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepcotes by the way, and where was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. They were in the cave as well, in hiding. And the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. While Saul slept, David did what? Took a knife and cut off part of his robe. Then listen to what it says then. And it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. He cuts it off, and then what happens? His conscience hurt him. Now, was this a major deal? I mean, really, when you think about it, cutting off. I mean, between the two of them, yes, it was. But to cut off a king's garment, it's disrespect for sure. And David did not want to show disrespect for that. And he said to his men in verse 6, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out mine hand against him, seeing that he is the anointed of the Lord. David's respect for God and for God's anointed shows again that his heart is in the right spot. Now, he even, whenever Saul leaves, he goes out and he said, Hey, Saul, I could have done this, but I didn't. I could have taken your life. David had respect for God. 2 Samuel 24. Maybe we get there sooner or later. David was, in this chapter here, numbered the children of Israel, the fighting forces. And he sent Joab out to number them. And Joab tried to tell him no, but he insisted. And Joab came back with the number and gave him the number. Here are the fighting forces that you have, David. And then it struck him that he had done wrong. First of all, did he have authority to go do what he did? No. God did not tell him to do that. But God was wroth with David. And look what it said here. After he had given him the sum, in verse 12, back in verse 11. And David was up in the morning. The word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, Go and say to David, Thus saith the Lord, I offer thee 3 things. Choose thee one of them, that I may do unto thee. So Gad came to David and told him and said unto him, Shall 7 years of famine come unto thee in thy land? Okay, so your first option, 7 years of famine. Or wilt you flee 3 months before your enemies, or 3 months of running when they'll be pursuing you, or 3 days of pestilence in the land? Now advise and see what answer I shall return to him that sent me. David, you've got a choice. 7 years, three months, or 3 days. And he chose the 3 days. And God sent a pestilence, and the angel was destroying them. Down in verse 17 it said, And David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel that smote the people, and said, Lo, I have sinned, and I have done wickedly. But these sheep, what have I done? Let thine hand, I pray, be against me and against my father's house. And Gad came that day to David and said to him, Go up and rear up an altar unto the Lord in the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. And David, according to the saying of Gad, went up as the Lord commanded. And Araunah looked and saw the king and his servants coming toward him, and he went out and bowed himself down before the king with his face to the ground. And he said, Wherefore is my Lord come to his servant? And David said, To buy the threshing floor of thee, to build an altar unto the Lord, that the plague may be stayed from the people. He's not thinking of himself, he's thinking of his people. And Araunah said to David, Let my lord the king take and offer up what seemeth good unto him. Behold, here be oxen for burnt offerings, and threshing floor instruments, and other instruments for the oxen for wood. And all these things did Araunah of the king give unto the king, and said unto him, The Lord thy God accept thee. And look what David said. And the king said to Araunah, No, but I will surely buy it of thee at a price. Neither will I offer burnt offerings unto the Lord my God of that which cost me nothing. I love that statement. I will not offer to the Lord of that which cost me nothing. What was David going to offer? What was he told to offer? What word would we use for that? A sacrifice? How do we use the word sacrifice? How is it used here? To offer an animal up on an altar to God. I mean, slaughter the animal, go through the whole situation. But what is a sacrifice?
Sacrifice is you give something of value for something of great value.
Exactly. I give up something to get something else. And in, like Joel said, something of greater value. What was David giving up? A lamb. But it was his lamb. This was his sin. And David knew that. But what was he getting back for it?
Deliverance of the people.
Deliverance of his people, which David loved. David loved his people. But David also got forgiveness. Now, it was all in future, I realize that, but he got forgiveness from God for that because he had disobeyed God. What was the problem in him numbering his men? Where was that sin? Why would you number your armies?
Faith.
I'm sorry?
To know how many you had, then you could then put trust in you and not in God.
Exactly. Alan?
I think it'd been forbidden too.
Yeah, I think it had too. But the reason was like Missy said, you count how many you have, and you're putting your faith in your armies, not in God. David knew what it meant to sacrifice. And like Joel said, you're giving up something. Sometimes if I want something, usually it's money. If something I want something, what have I got to give up? Usually it's money. I give up this, but we usually get value for value. This was something greater. He got something greater than what he offered up in value. But he wouldn't give something that didn't cost him something. After David became king, or anointed, Saul was still alive. One of Saul's sons, Jonathan, was David's closest friend. And as the time came near that Saul was going to be killed, and Jonathan would too. I mean, they didn't realize it was going to happen when it did. They spent some time together, and in 1 Samuel, the 20th chapter, they had a discussion because David was not going to go to the daily luncheon with the king. And he had missed a couple of days. And they both knew that Saul was wanting to kill David. And so they made up a pact so that Jonathan would be able to tell him, my dad is still after you. Or, no, things have calmed down. But they hadn't. And they made a pact between them to warn him. And in verses 14 through 17 there of that verse, go back to verse 13. And the Lord do so and much more to Jonathan, but if it please my father to do thee evil, then I will show it to thee and send thee away, that thou mayest go in peace, and the Lord be with thee as he hath been with my father. And here's what he asked. And thou shalt not only while yet I live, show me the kindness of the Lord, that I die not, but also that thou shalt not cut off thy kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord cut off the enemies of David ever from the face of the earth. And so Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, let the Lord even require it at the hand of David's enemies. And Jonathan caused David to swear again, because he loved him, for he loved him as his own soul. His best friend was the son of the king that David was going to replace. What happened whenever a king took over in a lot of times from another king, especially in a hostile takeover? Wiped out all the family. No reprisals. Just wipe them out. But look over in 2 Samuel, the 4th chapter. David has become king. Saul has died. Jonathan was killed. And in 2 Samuel, the 4th chapter, verse 4, it said, And Jonathan's son Saul had a son that was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the tidings came of Saul and Jonathan out of Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it came to pass, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. That's an interesting name, I've often thought. But look what a few more chapters over in chapter 9. David has come in and he is looking at basically what he has before him. And David said in verse 1, Is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there was of the house of Saul a servant whose name was Ziba. And when he had called him unto David, the king said unto him, Art thou Ziba? And he said, Thy servant is he. And the king said, Is there not yet any of the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God unto him? And Ziba said to the king, Jonathan hath a son, which was lame in his feet. And the king said unto him, Where is he? And Ziba said unto the king, Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lobador. I don't like the names there, but I'm stuck with them. And the king David sent and fetched him out of the house of Mishar to the son of Ammiel from Lobador. And when Mephibosheth, the son of David, the son of Saul, was come into David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said to Mephibosheth, called him by name Mephibosheth, and he answered, Behold thy servant. And David said unto him, Fear not, for I will surely show kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all of the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. And he bowed himself and said, What is thy servant, that thou should look upon such a dead dog as I am? And then he calls Saul's servant, and he says to him, Saul's servant, I have given unto thy master's son all that pertains to Saul and to his house. Thou therefore and thy sons and thy servants. Now this is Saul's servant he's talking to now. Therefore, thou and thy sons and thy servants shall till the land for him, for Mephibosheth, and thou shalt bring in the fruits that thy master's sons may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, the master's son, shall eat bread always at my table. Mephibosheth was taken care of by David. He had made a promise, and that promise meant something to him. Besides, what did the Old Testament say about making a promise? Keep it. If you swear something, you do it. We know that David had that sin with Bathsheba, and we won't go back and rehash all that. We know that. But look at the writings of what David said in Psalm. Turn to Psalm 51. This is the psalm that David penned. And it says at the top of it, the Psalm of David when Nathan the prophet came unto him after he had gone into Bathsheba. And the first 10 verses basically, Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness, according to the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgression, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee only have I sinned, and done this evil in thy sight. Now we'll skip down to verse 7. Purge me with hyssop, that I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow. Make me to hear joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Hide my face from my sins. Blot out mine iniquities. Then verse 10. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Create in me a clean heart. The penitence that David had, David realized what he had done. When it was pointed out to him by Nathan, it was, and it hurt David. A man after God's own heart. And so we see that not being perfect, even the serious, I mean, he committed adultery, murder, still a man after God's own heart because he made it right. Psalm 23. We won't read the whole thing. Everybody knows it. I hope if you don't know it by heart, you should. But this was written by a shepherd. As he was a shepherd as a boy. And as a king, is he still a shepherd of his people? Sure. He is the leader of them. He's supposed to be the physical leader and the spiritual leader. But when he talks here in Psalms 23, he is talking of himself as being a lamb under a good shepherd, the Lord. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And as he goes through it at the end, he talks about living, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. His desire was to serve God. Did he have mistakes? Sure he did. But he made them right. His heart was of the kind that God wants all of us to have. You know, I don't know that, of course, there's no more gospel, no more writings being done now. So we will not have our name showing up in a Bible somewhere that says, Roger was a man after God, or Alan was. Or those won't happen for us, even though we may, and even if we'd lived back then, we may not have gotten that, because look at the other men that were there that lived and served God faithfully. Only 5 men got those designations. But Hebrews, the 11th chapter, we're going to close here in verse 5. There's a statement that's said there that I think we can all see. This chapter of faith. It says, by faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found because God had translated him. This is the King James. But here's what we can take our thing in. For before his translation he had this testimony, that he pleased God. We can do that. We can all be, whether we're man or woman, we can all please God. Thank you so much. I appreciate your comments.